Welcome back, everyone. If you'd like to quickly take your seats as the dinner bell ran a bit late there to get everyone back. If you're coming back in, I encourage you to come down to the front. This is where all the action is happening. Come on down, everybody, and if you have got a hot or cold drink with you, be really careful. Last year I put mine on one of those sloping things and it ended up all over my lap. You might balance it there at first, but it is very tenuous hold on your cups there. All right, I think we'll get going. And welcome back, everybody, to this session on road user charging. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speakers from the shiny new MCERT. We have Anna Wilson-Farrell and Matthew Skinner. If you'd like to welcome them up. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to mention about Slido here. For those of you who are coming in new to the room, all of the questions are going through the Slido app. We're not doing questions with mics or anything like that. If the speakers finish quickly, we'll have time for a question at the end of their session before we move on to the next speaker. Otherwise, there will be a Q&A session with all of the speakers at the end, but we're going to try and get an individual question in between. And remember to upvote questions that you like. Thank you.
Wonderful, I can work it. Kia ora koutou, ko Anna Wilson-Farrell tōku ingoa. Good morning, I'm the Director of Revenue at, I've written it down so I do remember it, the Ministry for Cities, Environment, Regions and Transport. That took effect just Wednesday last week, so this may well be one of the first presentations that anyone at MCERT has given. Woo. I'm joined here today by my colleague Matt Skinner and also another of my colleagues, Rachel Crawley, who may well wave. We're all here for the next couple of days really keen to talk to you about the road user charges transition in particular. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's great to be in a room that has so much practical expertise spanning transport and technology, and I just wanted to acknowledge the contributions that many of you have already made to our requests for information, to submissions on the revenue bill that's currently before Parliament, and on proposed regulations recently. We've been really pleased by who we've heard from internationally as well as domestically. Some of you also will have been thinking about this for a very, very long time, so thank you for that. So today we are going to cover the journey so far, the modernisation work the government currently has underway, and how we're preparing for the next phases of the transition. The main point that I want to start out with is that this is not just a funding change, it's a system change. The RUC system, when we transition the whole fleet, really needs to work for our existing RUC users and millions of future users, and the transport and technology sectors that can help deliver those services. There has been a lot of interest in New Zealand's approach. We're very conscious of that, and today we'll explain where we are, what the government has decided, and what you will see next. Before we get into that, I just want to step through briefly where the transition to road user charges fits in the system and government priorities. So we have a long-standing principle here in New Zealand that road users contribute to the cost of the transport network. The tools we use to collect that revenue need to keep pace with investment needs, changing vehicles and changing user expectations. We have a system that sees road user charges, fuel excise duty and motor vehicle registrations contribute around 4.5 billion per annum to the National Land Transport Fund. In recent years, the Crown has tipped in almost as much to top up that fund and keep pace with the investment priorities and demands. The government in this term put in place a land transport revenue action plan that brings together a package of reforms, of which the transition to road user charges is one, alongside tolling reforms, the time of use charging scheme that Andrew Baker spoke about earlier today. Auckland is likely to be the first cab off the rank with the time of use charging scheme. And most recently just reaffirmed that commitment with the response to the Infrastructure Commission's National Infrastructure Plan just a couple of weeks ago, recommitting to that transition to road user charges along with a review of the broader land transport funding system. And that review is about ensuring financial sustainability, enhanced outcomes for people by aligning investment expectations with the available revenue and accountability and delivery. Moving the fleet is one part of that wider shift that will hopefully help us create a system that is much fairer, more efficient and more sustainable over time. So I will hand to Matt, who will focus on the RUC component here and now.
So our RUC system, it's been around since the 1970s, and in many respects, especially from a charging perspective, it's still world leading. But it's worth remembering that it was designed for a different era. For most users, there's still an element of pre-purchasing, of tracking your distance and your odometer readings, and buying and displaying a paper license. The last major reform that we did to the system was in about 20 years ago, and it was based on an independent review that did fundamentally look at the system. But since then, we've had a greater uptake of electronic RUC, and EVs have entered the system, and technology has improved. So we've got a lot of different opportunities to how we charge than what we've had in the past. And so today, Anna and I are going to take you through what the next stage of that process looks like and how we get towards that future state. Where's the clicker? Good. The first step, which we're already on the way towards, is modernising the existing RUC system for existing RUC users. The future step, which comes later and worth reiterating here that the government hasn't committed to a date yet, is the future full transition of petrol vehicles into the road user charges system. And at the same time, that would involve removing petrol excise duty, and it needs further legislation and careful design to make sure that we get it right. Hence, we haven't yet committed to the date. The reason that we're doing it in this order is relatively straightforward. Modernisation gives us the platform, evidence and the private sector readiness that we need to be able to manage the future transition of that scale before we ask millions of users to move into the system. This slide, the top half of it shows the things that we're changing now, and these things will come into force next year. So there are some real tangible things, especially for a lot of people in this room, that are happening sooner than the long-term transition. These are practical changes that will make RUC easier, more flexible and more modern for users, and important that we get them done now before we start to think about shifting everybody else. The bit down the bottom, that green box, is some of the policy and system design thinking that we know that we need to do before making the wider transition. And Anna will cover that in more detail shortly, so I won't go into too much detail here. To test the readiness of the private sector towards moving to a more modern system, we ran a request for information process late last year and early this year. We heard from 44 different organisations spanning Companies like existing ruck providers, fleet management providers, and businesses that see a future opportunity in the ruck space. A big thank you to those of you for the effort that went into the responses. It's given us a much richer view of the possible provider landscape, the barriers that people are seeing, and the types of services that could emerge if we get the settings right. There's a strong level of interest in delivering ruck services across the private sector, and many potential solutions out there. And the question isn't, it's no longer simply whether the private sector can help, it's how we design the framework so providers can enter, innovate, and deliver services that are actually going to work. And so now I'll talk a little bit about what this modernised system actually looks like. We'll have the ruck collector, which effectively becomes the regulator of the ruck system. At the moment, that's NZTA, and sitting beneath that, we'll have a range of different ruck providers that will be approved by the collector, and they'll all offer different services. At the moment, users, in the way that they comply with the ruck system, they use typically the blue options, especially for light vehicles. That's over the counter via one of NZTA's agents or online through the NZTA website. Those channels will remain, and we're modernising the system to enable more things, so all those things that you can see in green there, so that will help a broader set of models develop for users to comply with road user charges. And as I said before, we've heard from a lot of providers about the services that they'll offer, and those green boxes there basically pick up we've heard from people that they want to provide all of those different services. So there is some real exciting opportunities out there that we hope to see enter once the legislation changes next year. Also worth noting that, as Anna mentioned before, we have a bill in the House at the moment that will enable all of this, and it just went through its second reading last week, so we're getting there. And the overall point here that I just want to make one more time is we need to move away from the current government-delivered licensing model towards enabling different technology and different service providers to innovate and play a bigger role in making ruck easy for users. And as I said, the technology already exists, and the challenge is for us designing a framework that enables it to happen. Pass back to Anna.
I think Carol's session this morning actually did a lot of my job for me. I was going to emphasise here that we are really conscious that different people have really different needs in a system like this. We know that we need physical and assisted channels. We know privacy is a real concern for people. We know that people will expect really strong control over data. We want to make sure there are a really broad range of options available and that people have different providers and channels to choose from. I can see some photos being taken. You are welcome. So while we've got this modernisation phase underway, I suppose I really want to reference, we know that this is not easy. There's a ton that we have to do to work through the full transition. And Cabinet's given us a few principles to guide our work and our policy advice to them. It is that our work must have an end user focus, be focused on revenue protection, efficiency, equity and privacy. And thinking about those principles, we've just set out some of the things that we're really conscious of. If I pick a couple, collection obviously needs to be really efficient. We're moving from a system where people are paying their fuel excise duty when they fill up their vehicle. They don't even think about the proportion probably of that cost that is going to the National Land Transport Fund. That's going to be quite a different model when it's when you've got a choice about how you pay, when you pay. We think about models that are hinged on, as it is now, assessing whether your ruck is up to date at the time of your warranty fitness check. We don't want to have a system in place like that that then perhaps deters people from those safety checks that are critically important. Those pricing and payment settings need really careful design, how rates are set, how they're charged, and how those are reviewed over time. And obviously a really big challenge to even think about whether a transition is phased or if it's a really hard line switch from Fed to RUC on one day. We're also really conscious of the need and opportunity for RUC to integrate with the broader system, with tolling, with time of use charging and other mechanisms that people will be experiencing that contribute to their costs. So, thank you. So what you'll see from us next is when the bill passes and we're certain about the tenor of it and the detail, you will see a whole lot more communications start to come from us about the ability to start applying to be an approved provider, and the research and evidence base that we'll be wanting to gather to inform those next steps. As Matt said, date TBC. So we're all here and welcome to take questions over the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to move straight on to the next speaker, just to keep it going. There are some questions coming through on Slido. Hopefully we have time for a Q&A session at the end of this. And I'd now like to introduce Peter Carr from E-Road. E-Road have, of course, been a long time player in the ITS regarding RUC.
Kia ora koutou katoa, so ko Peter Carr, taku ingoa. Those of you who are lucky enough not to know me, I'm with E-Road. Prior to that, I was Ministry of Transport. But transport's my second job. I started off in social sector, youth justice, youth suicide prevention work. When I came to transport about 15 years ago, three things struck me. One, the acronyms, yes, completely different. Secondly, the eye-watering sums of money that got bandied about. So when I was trying to get 20K for a community service provider, I turned up in a place where my first job was to secure an unneeded $300 million capital bridging loan just in case roads of national significance went off track. And that was 2 months' work compared to 2 years to get that 20K. So this place is swimming in money. But the other thing was that when you talk about connectivity, if you had run a Wordle at that time, you would have thought connectivity was all about flying cars and robot taxis. Yes, mobility as a service was poking its head up and coming its way through, but it was very much kind of a vehicle-centered sort of discussion, just based on word count. I mean, I don't want to downplay the fact that there was a whole lot of other really cool stuff going on. There were some great conferences and programs, but really that was dominant. And one of the things that I was grateful for Carol doing with her talk this morning, but for those of you who were here last year, Nina Elsa did as well in her keynote speak, was bring the person back into the middle of this. And so when we're talking about all these really cool mechanisms for making transport more intelligent, we've got to be mindful of the fact that what we're also doing is creating these really cool mechanisms for dumping even more information onto people who are carrying massive cognitive burdens. It is incredibly difficult. If someone sat down and lined up their whole trip and the pauses and the transitions and things, there's a massive mental load to work through. And ironically, last year, we were still thinking about the one app to rule them all. That kind of became the default. And so as the heading says, it's probably not going to be an app. I mean, right now, the dystopic version is it's probably some kind of AI attached to Google or another search engine, but it'll be something that works across the whole marketplace of apps, if you're lucky, or a heavily curated set of commercial sponsor-provided single choices that then helps you build out and plan your thing, but it won't be an app. But this is kind of liberating for a company like E-Road, because what it says is the conversation is allowed to relax a little and go back to focusing on the kinds of quality of components that we bring in. So this talk is picking up on the RUC stuff, so thank you for the Ministry for speaking before me and giving you the introduction to the RUC changes. But also this notion that actually the RUC change is a change within a system, and in itself it's not just about making tax easy to pay. I know we all love having the tax payment process be easier for us. We all love paying tax because of all the benefits we get from it. But it's not just about that. There is actually inevitably some knock-on kind of consequences from the way we choose to pursue this RUC opportunity that feeds back into this complex ecosystem, this complex infosphere, which may help others, help people find their way through as they try and wrap their heads around their obligations, how to give effect to their mobility choices. Hopefully it's somewhere on an ITS website. I do recommend Nina's talk from last year for those who want to kind of dive into it. But the key point here being connectivity fails to the extent it doesn't deal with complexity, and that complexity sits on the shoulders of individuals. All of them are a little bit different, some of them a lot different, but it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of scenario. So in RUC, though, what are we talking about? Well, for starters, I had a note which said there wasn't going to be a screen here, but apparently there is. I can see my slides, so life is good. With RUC, there's this kind of journey, right? But with connectivity, there's this other journey, which is about how do we get all these vehicles actually connected and talking to things. The takeaway from this slide is that connectivity is coming through with OEM telematics and so forth, but for New Zealand, this is a 2-decade journey. So if you're doing anything that's premised on the notion that there are connected vehicles out there that you can leverage, you are 20 years back from when you're really going to be able to do that. So if you really want those benefits, you're going to need a bridging solution. I think last year, or maybe the year before, I told you we had set the challenge on ourselves about bringing the cost of an onboard unit suitable for regulatory RUC down from $500 US to produce to a tenth of that, $50 US. We've punched through that. Manoj and others in the sector here will tell you that you can probably be getting it for under $50 New Zealand these days, depending on the regulatory case and the structures that are put around that kind of technology. So in terms of myth busting, at a household level, $50 to drop a unit into each of your cars is probably still a bit punishing, but there are funding pathways. There's a whole variety of funding pathways. Having secured an unnecessary $300 million capital bridging loan for the NZTA, I can tell you getting money is not the hard point if you understand what you want to deliver with that money. Oops, wrong way. It's not a journey. Well, it is a journey, but not a very clear path. There are multiple pathways. As I said, there are a lot of unknowns in the future. Acronym soup for those of you who are still wading your way into this. So RUC, road user charges. E-RUC is what we do, GPS-based location services. EA-RUC is a name I invented when we were acquiring Cortex that NZTA hates, but then made official, so there you go, which is just using some form of electronics in the RUC purchase system to make it a bit easier. APS is an alternative payment scheme, which is a really cool piece of legislative technology that may make transaction fees much, much smaller if we can leverage it. Light diesel vehicles, heavy petrol vehicles, light EVs, light plug-in hybrid EVs, heavy electric vehicles, light petrol vehicles again, there we go. It's all through there. We don't know how far this reform is going to go. If you were modernising RUC just for the sake of getting petrol vehicles on RUC, you probably wouldn't do it because there is a massive cost uplift involved in that. There needs to be something else that comes with it to make it worth the cost of a transition, in my humble opinion. When we talk with the current government, they kind of recognise that, but they don't really talk about it out loud because it's quite scary. Why? Because companies like mine and others will track everybody. Happily track everybody. Those of you who work with the data know that there is so much of it. There's no way in the world any of us have the time to look at any particular individual. So, well, there we go. Point being, though, if we do go around and LoJack everybody, and it does seem to be affordable at a macro kind of level, there are a lot of outcomes that can be unlocked once you've kind of got that information sitting there. And even once you've managed the privacy sides of things, and for example, location information get collected on the vehicle says, oh, I owe a toll, gets destroyed on the vehicle, and it's just the fact that there's a toll liability gets passed through. All that stuff is possible. These aren't particular issues from a technological point of view. But you can do things like then you open a door for usage-based insurance, you open a door for things like driver feedback, you open the door for performance-based driver licensing if you really wanted to do it, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that this technology, once it's in the vehicle, 20 years from now or sooner if you invest in the transition, can bring about. But it's not to say there aren't challenges. With the whole RUC transition, there's a whole bunch of public fear. I think RUC on Rails are going to be speaking later. Hopefully they'll talk about the research they did. We did our own, not under our own name. If you read the verbatims, like the one in all caps there, people thought we were a government entity asking them about RUC, and they were not shy about telling us what they don't like about the whole idea. They recognise its cost plus. They recognise its effort plus if you move from petrol onto RUC. So whatever we do in this space has got to tackle those two things before we even get to questions of smart technology and tracking people and managing the privacy implications of that and assuring them that we're not slowly turning into Russia or somewhere similar. And of course, affordability. Right? We were just before things really pinched with the oil shock when we did this, but even then, affordability was still a question. Probably will be for a while to come. This is the slide where if I get buzzed off the stage, it's one I wanted to make sure I talk to you all about, though, because this is the barely visible elephant in the room, which is admin fees. So at the moment, if you purchase a ruck license through the NZTA online, you're paying somewhat over $13 for your transaction. It doesn't matter how much ruck you buy, it's $13 a pop. You know, it's a tax on being poor, because if you can't afford to buy large amounts of ruck all at once, you have to do multiple purchases. And if you're an average user, so you're a solo mum who drives the average distance, you might be buying 12 licenses. So suddenly you've now spent whatever 12 times 13 is, right? Whereas someone like me would buy that whole lot probably for 2 years in one go. So I get a massive discount relative to this person. But the thing with the admin fees is that they actually control costs and they control the opportunity for private sector involvement in this sector. Now, I think a lot of foreign companies, when this came out, they looked at it and said, oh, $4.5 billion revenue stream. Over here, we'd be able to clip the ticket to 1%, or whatever it may be, or we would get paid. That doesn't happen here. Or AA gets paid because they're acting like a front desk. But EROAD does not get paid at all to collect this money. Now, you're thinking, what a bunch of dummies. How the hell did you sign that up? Well, we're a shiny new startup in 2010 with no power whatsoever, dealing with a regulator who had massive market power, and they put all the financial risk and all the cost onto us, and here we are. Now you're thinking, well, that's just one channel. That's all right, we can step past that, they'll change the model. This one channel collects 30% of all road user charges. We collect 62% of all heavy vehicle road user charges. So a massive amount of government revenue in this space is collected at no further charge. The cost base is set by the admin fees. The ability to make money is the wedge between the admin fee now and whatever the admin fee is in the future. So that figure has to come down. Now this chart, I'm ranting here, but never mind. This chart, that bottom line, that pale blue, when the NZTA consulted on the admin fees, that was unexplained cost attributed to ruck transactions. Funnily enough, that disappeared when the advice went to Cabinet, and funnily enough, the Cabinet paper didn't tell them it had disappeared. But that's $3.02. There was a 230% increase in the cost through EROAD for no better reason than that blue line and that orange one above it, which we think is our customers subsidising credit card merchant costs for people using the NZTA. Right? So you think about moving to what's meant to be a market-led model, private retail provision, bringing innovation into this to make life easier for everybody and make the system cheaper. Bloody difficult to do when you've got more than 100% of the true cost to serve tagged onto what you're doing. That is the wedge private sector needs to be able to access to deliver the benefits at the kind of scale wanted. That's the elephant in the room. That is the single biggest blocker to this future path going forward on this particular channel. Of course, there are also other concerns. If you do let us through, we still have to prove to the public that we're not going to misuse their data. Interestingly enough, people are kind of interested in the benefits. Sorry. Certainly a large minority, maybe a slight majority of people are open to the idea that there'll be benefits that tech can bring. No one wants to pay for it though, so that's not exactly a surprise. So there are things that definitely have to be worked through there, but there are funding channels. Again, $300 million, it wasn't needed. To be fair, it also wasn't spent and interest wasn't paid on it, so it was net neutral for everybody, but it was wonderfully easy to get hold of. So we believe that there is, I've no idea what time it is, room for hope amid the uncertainty. It is clearly a direction of travel around ruck reform with bipartisan support. It was fantastic hearing opposition parties line up behind this move. And of course, if you're in opposition, there's nothing better than the incumbent government doing things in the tax space, because you know everyone, again, will happily vote on the basis of tax increases and improvements to a tax system. But there are options for realistic value-add services if we get the tech out. There's definitely a foundation of consumer demand to work with. It won't take us the whole way there. At some point, government leadership would be necessary if you want the connectivity before those 20 years come by. It's technically viable. There are technically viable options for all user personas. You know, there's been some fantastic work about how you might get these kinds of things into the hands of unbanked people, low-income people, and so forth. A number of us, again, I think are having the same kinds of conversations. There's definitely access to international standards, which then gives us access to scale economies. You only need to be able to do a run. 10 runs of 100,000 units, right, will get you the cheapest possible tech you ever want. Ruck for All in New Zealand is 5 of those. So you could have 5 different suppliers easily channeling hardware into this country. So there's competition, there's affordability, all at internationally comparable prices that's available there. And finally, international evidence that public confidence can be grown by governments. So it won't be tech that slow things down. And ironically enough, actually may also be multiple apps rather than just one app. Even we're working on one, so there you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. These are such rich information around ruck that we're getting through. I'm going to let the speakers do it, and we'll keep the questions to the end. Rather than have general questions, if you have a question that's for a specific speaker, if you could just write their name at the front of the question to upload that. So I'm very pleased now to welcome Scott Wilson from CDM Smith. Away you go.
No, it's not working, is it?
It's going to come up on the screen directly beside you now.
Oh, okay. Before this all starts, I should say I'm honoured and grateful to be speaking to you today and to be bookending the collection of people who are current or past MOT. And out of the, as the fourth speaker, I'm the dinosaur of the groups, as I started working on road user charging when I joined MOT 26 years and 2 weeks to this day. And the late Dr. Roger Tolman said, right, you're going to start working on eRuck. What's eRuck? Well, that's electronic road user charges. You know what they are? Yeah, vaguely. And there was a project called the eRuck study, which is where we all got to, where eRoad came from, and where we are today. And I haven't worked all the time on ruck since then, but full disclosure, I am assisting the Ministry, the Ministry of Transport, I don't know if I'm assisting the new one, on road user charging. What I want to talk to you about today is what New Zealand really is at the frontier of this. And what you've got there is a few images. This is what ruck looks like for New Zealand at the moment, is the first three of those images. And the next two are really what, where things are heading in the future. And I think there are both risks and challenges, and this is because where New Zealand is today is actually so far ahead of the rest of the world. So I'll briefly talk about ruck, and the picture there is the reason why ruck exists. The sole policy reason in 1978 it was introduced was to introduce fairer charges for trucks running on the highways at the same time as land transport was deregulated. Up till 1978, you couldn't move freight with a long list of exemptions, more than 40 miles by road in New Zealand. And the government of the day, following a report done by a company called Wilbur Smith, which is actually the predecessor to my current employer, wrote a very long report about transport in New Zealand. It is available in libraries. It covered all sectors that said there should be a weight distance charge. And this is how trucks should pay to use the roads because it's a fairer way for doing so. It was designed for commercial vehicles, but today, most vehicles on ruck are light, personal vehicles. And Peter's talked about eRuck, and today it collects a great deal of that revenue. And we already have 1.3 million vehicles on it. This is the largest light ruck system in the world. There is a larger, heavier one, it's Germany, but everything there is 3.5 tonnes and above. And there's a lot of money collected. There's $2 billion collected. And if you look at the cost of collecting that at the moment, it's a small percentage of that. And the transition to ruck that the government announced has got two key bases of it, and that's already been discussed. One of them is revenue sustainability. And we could talk about electric vehicles and hybrids being on the system, but around 30% of light vehicle sales last year were standard hybrid vehicles. And the average fuel efficiency of new petrol cars is substantially more efficient than the existing fleet. So where this hits you is in fairness. And average car in New Zealand drives around 12,000 kilometres. And the one that pays the least to do that would be a hybrid Swift. Is it the most energy efficient? Well, no, because the Tesla and the diesel Wildtrak pay the same to use the roads. The Swift gets a big discount just because it's on fuel excise. If you've got a plug-in hybrid Range Rover and you're paying ruck, you're still better off. But if you've got an old Kia Carnival, well, you're paying through the nose. And certainly if you've got a V8 Commodore, you really are paying through the nose. And you might think, well, that doesn't really matter because they've bought a big engine, they're doing that. But what's the system actually paying for? The system's paying for a land transport fund. And we've got this little tool in the background. The ministry has this tool, which is used to inform advice on it. And it says that a light vehicle should be paying that, 7.6 cents per kilometre, because a bit of economic modelling says that most of the costs are common costs. They're not attributable to road wear and tear. The vehicles that pay the most are the ones that generate the most costs of the system. But at the moment, there's a really reasonable policy reason why the Swift driver should be paying the least, and the person paying the most is the Commodore, when we don't have a system that exists for emissions or any other purpose. It's there to pay to fund the infrastructure. So where in the world has done this big transition? Well, there's one, and it's this little country. Iceland did it very quietly. I'm not sure if it got too much advice on this. I remember we had a phone call when we were a smaller company a few years ago where Iceland talked to us about what's going on in the rest of the world, and we talked to them about that, and then suddenly they did it. So they, as of the beginning of this year, all vehicles in Iceland are paying by distance. If you've got a car or a truck in Iceland, every month you'll be said you've got a monthly invoice. Did you send us an odometer reading? No. Well, you were charging the average of what it takes, just like a power bill without a meter. And if you want to send your odometer reading, you might pay more, pay less, but every year they'll check it up when you do the equivalent of a WAF. Now, Iceland's all very well, but we're not Iceland. But where else in the world? Well, there's others that have looked at it, and Hawaii is currently the only one that's announced that all light vehicles will go into RUC. Hawaii is fairly small. But 3 countries have tried. They've tried to do a really big bang. The UK in 2005 announced there'd be national road pricing. Everybody would pay per mile everywhere they go. You'd have congestion pricing, it'd be fantastic. And it got cancelled 2 years later because online petitions were launched. And the biggest online petition for Tony Blair was to petition national road pricing. So it died. And the UK is now just starting to talk about RUC for EVs. The Netherlands has tried twice. And you can see it brings down governments, but they've only just launched heavy vehicle RUC from the 1st of July this year. So that's a step for them. Finland announced that it was going to move everybody onto RUC, and 2 weeks later, that minister had to pull it and resigned because it was so unpopular. So don't do too much in one go. And elsewhere in Europe, leaving aside Iceland, there's quite a lot of RUC, but it's all for heavy vehicles, and for most of them, it's just on the main roads. So there's a lot of experience, but we've already got heavy RUC here. And the problem in Europe is that fuel tax for EU countries is mandatory. The minimum level they've all got to have is equivalent of 72 cents a litre. So they can't introduce RUC and then refund fuel duty because fuel duty has got nothing to do with transport. So what do you do? In the US, there's quite a lot of interest in RUC, and it'd be fair to say the majority of my time is spent on these various projects. But again, it's mostly for EVs, and Vermont in the last couple of weeks announced it was going to be introducing RUC for EVs from the 1st of January. Still, we're only talking about EVs and plug-in hybrids. And yeah, there's heavy RUC, but I won't go into that because those are old legacy systems that make New Zealand's system look like it's the most sophisticated in the world. There's a lot of research, and there are good steps forward there, but again, if you want to do a full transition, there's not that much to learn. So what are the risks of a RUC transition? Well, I see there's 2 big categories. One is public concern, because like Peter said, if you lose social licence, the whole thing's over. And as you can see with the UK, Finland and the Netherlands, once the public sees that there's nothing in it for them, or worse, they're going to be worse off, they're just going to reject it. So first is the fear of double taxation. I'd say the immediate response to that is to show people diesel. And in New Zealand, we're all pretty used to looking at service stations, see the price of diesel is a bit, thankfully now, cheaper than petrol. Fear of tracking. People don't like the idea the government is going to do some whiz-bang thing, like some of the things that Peter were talking about, where people know where you are and what you're doing, just fearing it. So having a manual option is really important. Fears of non-compliance. It's not you being non-compliant, it's that neighbour of yours who is all very dodgy and they're not going to pay, and that's not fair. Why should I pay if they're not going to pay? And concerns about fairness. Why should I have to pay a big chunk of money just to be able to drive for the next couple of months? And one option for doing that is to have enable smaller increments of RUC to be able to be bought. Then there's the admin concerns, the other concerns that the ministry be rightfully worried about. Revenue leakage, which is the flip side of non-compliance. Fuel duty doesn't really have that issue. There's a level of non-compliance in the RUC system now, but the idea that this becomes, centre of everybody to say, well, can I just get around that by just not declaring something or just not buying something? What are you really going to do? Delivery of large-scale change. We've had a reference this morning to a very large-scale government IT project in the transport sector, and you probably don't want to do that again. And in fact, another earlier UK attempt in the space called lorry road user charging, Google that, you won't find too much, failed because essentially the project just became this large IT project that the cost just went out of control. All the suppliers came in and said, no, it's going to cost this. It was several times Treasury estimates, and the whole thing got shut down. And lack of new market entry, which hopefully won't be the case. Either you do all the reforms and find out that actually potential suppliers aren't really there, but I think it's probably the lowest risk at the moment. But what about opportunities? One of the great opportunities is having better quality data about the use of the network. And eRUC already did that for heavy vehicles. But just be able to know more about the network usage is going to be a great advantage longer term in terms of network planning. Having more innovative products for road users. So it's not just the standard, go in and prepay a few kilometres. Having more flexible and less blunt options for tolling and time of use charging. And allowing, over time, more disaggregated pricing. And all of this comes from developing a more direct customer-supplier relationship. So at the moment, people pay fuel tax, they even pay RUC, and it's kind of forgotten about. And then there's a Land Transport Fund and NZTA, and things are done, stuff is built. This becomes more of a utility relationship where I'm paying for a service, and what am I getting in return? And if you notice more directly about what you're paying, you say, well, there's all these potholes here, or this bit of the network isn't working, or it's not resilient. Well, what's going on here? Who's accountable for that? And I'll flip one idea here, which is a bit of a brainstorm of what could you do for RUC with existing pricing and playing around with wholesaling RUC. And the first three are sort of the sort of stuff we've got now. Prepaid distance, being invoiced monthly, technically not that, but that's how it works with eRUC providers, or just paying for using public roads. You could have a subscription. You could say, well, $250 every quarter, all the RUC you want. Do whatever you like. And that's a bit like you could have with a utility provider where you say, well, this is the fixed fee you pay, and at the end of the year we work out whether you should still be paying that, or maybe you should be paying $300, or maybe you're going to pay $200 or $150 because you use it less. Having a bundled service with other suppliers like broadband or electricity. Peak, off-peak. So let's say you've got time of use charging using number plate technology. You say, well, okay, we're going to offer you, you drive peak time in Auckland, it's 20 cents a kilometre everywhere you go at that time. But off-peak, it's cheaper than what you pay now. Maybe have a two-part tariff where you pay a very small rate or a large rate, and then the weekends it's nearly free. These are all the sorts of ideas that you get in telecommunications. You go back 20, 25 years, people were paying for phone calls per minute. And the great innovation in the 1990s was $5, talk for 2 hours. This is all ancient history now because we've got mobile phones. But if you turn back, and when I was a child, the big deal of making a toll call from Wellington to Auckland at birthday time and just thinking about that's just so constraining upon what people did. And I'm not saying RUC is like that, but the thinking that we have around paying for transport is like that. And if we could get out of that space and have this sort of innovation that only really comes from innovative people, and I say RUC on Rails is showing part of that, then we can have something that's much more different and much more interesting. What does success look like? I think it involves trust. The public trusting that what is being done is actually for them and not something they should fear. Having choice and having flexibility around that choice. Better signals towards long-term maintenance and investment. We need that. It's one of the big issues we've got at the moment. Having better network operations and better information to users. And having better use of the existing network. And also road providers being more innovative in supply operations and pricing. And I'll just conclude, well, I've got my questionnaire on what might get in the way of success, and I'm looking forward to all the ideas for that. I went to an ITS conference 25 years ago, which was talking about all sorts of innovative technology. And the one thing that nobody ever talked about was mobile phones and what would happen then. Everybody was talking about, well, we'll get a device that we'll put in the car and it will do all the navigation and everything else that you want. You can order DVDs in advance in your car. And of course, Apple came in and blew it all away because the market structure enabled that to be done. So hopefully that's what we will get. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to now introduce Suzanne Murtha from AECOM in the USA, who's come over for this conference, and really looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
I'm Suzanne Murtha. At AECOM, I'm our global lead for emerging tech. So while my slides come up, first of all, isn't this awesome? Next generation tolling looks like that. It doesn't really. So to distract you from probably this less than ideal picture on the slide, I wanted to make a quick pitch for automated vehicles because I cover those too for AECOM. You know, and I've been here talking to a lot of folks about automated vehicles. One of the things I wanted to point out, as Carol wisely pointed out earlier, is that indeed Waymo doesn't work everywhere. You know, there are a lot of times when it doesn't work, and for sure all those times are on the news. Every time it doesn't work is on the news. If you get a chance, Google AECOM and Waymo and Avia, A-V-I-A. We did work for Waymo where we looked at the economic benefits of automation, and really, it'll blow your mind. 93% improvement in safety over 100 million miles. That is shocking, 93%. And so someone here is saying, those numbers are wrong. Maybe they are. Maybe they're half wrong. So then we have a 40% improvement in safety over 100 million miles. That's shocking and so good. So I just wanted to start off with some good news. All right. Okay, let's shift to tolling. You know, folks have done a great job of explaining most of this already here. So I'm going to focus on two of my favorite types of tolling. I lead our tolling practice, our global tolling practice, and my two favorite kinds are vision-based tolling and telematics-based tolling. I love them because they're so cool, and I think that this is where everything is going to shift. And Anna talked about it a little bit, and Matthew talked a little bit about it too, so I'm going to dig in a little bit more because we're actually doing some of this in the US. The things that I love about telematics for tolling, you see, look, there's no infrastructure needed. It comes direct, no infrastructure in the car and no infrastructure on the road. Directly working with the car companies to get data from them. They've been collecting data from cars for the past maybe 20 years already, so they're already collecting this data. So what if we can use that and save millions, maybe billions of infrastructure investment and not having to manage anything in the car? Super exciting to me. Vision-based, wait till you see this. We can get up cameras on the side of the road on mini poles for $100,000 in 24 hours. What? So cool. Okay. All right. Okay. Two kinds of connected vehicles. You may know about 5.9, 5.8 base connected vehicles. I saw Marcus Russell in the audience here. There you are. We worked together at CAPTCHA 100 years ago. We were the first people to deploy this stuff in the US. We wanted to do it for tolling. It is being used for tolling all over Singapore, in Austria, and some other places I'm probably missing, Marcus, that you can fill in during your presentation. We'll see how that takes off. I'm more excited for telematics using cellular and using right from the car because it has less infrastructure. The market forecast, you can look this up. There are hundreds of market forecasts saying that connected vehicles are going to become more connected and more of them. Yes, it might take 20 years to get the whole fleet connected, but actually many vehicles have been connected for many years already. And there also, I have Tesla over there. Teslas are super connected, and we're going to talk about which vehicles when. I'm going to fly through 5.9. You may know this. This is where the vehicles are equipped with a radio, for lack of a better term, a transponder, and the data goes back to whomever owns the box of the infrastructure that's collecting the data. In this case, in this picture, it is a traffic signal, but it could certainly be any kind of tolling infrastructure. And then the agency owns the data that they collect off the car. There's a standard for it. I was the original developer of this standard. I led this committee. You can go look it up. And it is a standard that describes the message set between the onboard unit and the roadside equipment. That's all. The standard covers that. So it describes the data that you need from the car to make a tolling transaction work. It's very cool. You can go look it up here. I can't share it because it's illegal, and I go to SAE jail if I share it. But if you look up SAE J3217, you'll see all the data you need to do a transaction for tolling, and that is agreed upon by the car companies, agreed upon by the toll agencies in the US, and we base that on international harmonized standards. Okay, using cellular. This is the data from the car. It goes back to the car company. We're going the other direction now, and this is already happening. And so the idea is here, we're working with some of the car companies. One I can tell you, Volvo, the other ones I can't talk about yet, to directly get the data from them directly to the agencies. Car companies have varying degrees of frequency with which they send the data from the car, and varying quantities of data and types of data. So one type of car might have one set of data, another might have another. This, I don't have all the car companies up here. These are the ones I've verified, I guess close to verified. Tesla is the most connected and sends the most data the most frequently. And that matters if you want to get a tolling transaction, right? So we're looking at how to do that, and Tesla's so cool that we can do it actually without even talking to Tesla. We can figure out how to do it with our own Teslas. The other big group is Stellantis. The Stellantis group sends a lot of data very frequently. They're the second largest. And the other ones are kind of coming along slowly, but the thing that I've learned is that when I go to these other OEMs here on the right, on my right, your left, is that when I tell them how fast Stellantis and Tesla are, they start talking about being able to speed up their data sends, which is super interesting because I think we're close to getting competitive. There's another company called Vera Mobility, and in this space we have a lot of startups, and people say to me, Vera, they're a startup, right? No, they're a $2 billion company. They had a rough last couple months. That's a story for drinks later, but they're doing something that I think is very cool. Here, I'll go faster there. Is that they have teamed with Stellantis, and in these Stellantis vehicles, we are able to install the Vera software inside the vehicles, and Vera software interacts with the software on the Stellantis vehicles and enables tolling applications because Stellantis also owns, Vera also owns a lot of the rental car accounts in the US. And so they have geofences about where the tolling happens. And so what they're able to do then is they use their software to speed up the send of the data from the Stellantis to make it faster when it enters a geofence. And the software there even asks the driver, do you want me to pay for your transaction? Do you want to work with me? You know, for the first time, it'll ask for interaction with the driver to make sure that the driver is okay with sharing their data. And then Vera will own that. And so now we can do it directly from the car without any infrastructure anywhere in the Stellantis vehicles. So I think that's a great model. You know, I'm going super fast here. I'm going to get us back on schedule. Is that where are we doing this? North Carolina DOT. J.J. Eden in North Carolina DOT. He hired me at AECOM 100 years ago, shortly after I worked with CAB. Maybe it was 50 years ago. But J.J. sees himself as a pioneer in tolling, and he runs the North Carolina Tolling Authority. And he wants to try out everything. And so he is working on the 5.9 based tolling. He's working with CAPS on that and with Indra on that, and you can check this out. This is all online. And their work on that. And he is also working with Volvo and me on doing the telematics cellular deployment on North Carolina Tolling Authority. So the idea is, you know, in the US, how am I on time? Am I okay? Do I have a funny little story. So I was in Australia a few years ago, and I was talking about advanced air mobility. There was a crowd like this side, and somebody raised their hand, and they said, well, what about social license? And I was like, social what now, right? And so they explained to me that here in this region, we have to get permission from everybody before we do things. Like people have said to me, you know, we don't have permission to operate automated vehicles here. In the US, that's kind of not how we roll. If we don't have a law that says we can't do it, that means we can do it. And so that's It's a little bit of a different, I'm not saying anything's right or wrong, I'm just saying it's different, right? And so like we're just gonna go do it. And so that's what we do, that's how we roll. And so we're just gonna go do it. We're gonna have at least Volvo. I suspect that in the next year and a half, maybe 2 years, we'll have half a dozen OEMs aligned on this. And we'll be doing this in at least 3 tolling agencies, I think. So anyway, let's move to vision-based tolling. Okay, so now I'm going to go fast because I took that time. All right, so we're working with a company called Blissway. I don't know if you've seen these guys. They're the ones on your right. And basically, they are deployed in Colorado, and they are deployed in also, they have 2 multi-state collaboration deployments, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast in California. And basically, they're able to install these cameras on the side of the road and able to do that almost overnight. They say 24 hours, but let's give them 48, you know, for the heck of it. And it's about $100,000 per unit. They don't require power. They have solar power, and they can send the data over cellular networks, which is really fantastic if you wanted to do something like RUC and you wanted to get it started earlier. Right, and so the numbers on those, the 2 studies have shown it to be over 99% effective, and some other studies have been a little bit less, but a lot of my clients think that it's a fantastic way to at least get started or replace gantries that are down. You know, it solves a lot of problems. It solves the time-intensive aspect of getting gantries up. It's a smaller capital investment. The OpEx is about the same as traditional tolling because they do charge per transaction. And also the clients really like it because it doesn't have anything doesn't have any equipment inside the car, and it, you know, and nobody likes to deal with that. Okay, I mentioned there is a multi-agency pilot, and that's in California. There's another one that's a couple years older on the East Coast, and that is deployed around Colorado. And so that's it. I have time for a question. Is there a, I think.
It's a bit hard to pick up ones that are specifically for you. I think we might just hold and get into a session and ask them of everyone that's there. I'd like to now introduce Shamil Yaqub, who is going to talk to us about the cost of stopping infrastructure.
Thank you. Before I start, I need to give you a disclaimer. I'm not going to give you any personalized financial advice today. I'm required by law to tell you that. But if you do want to sign up at Simplicity, it only takes 60 seconds. I had to do the marketing, otherwise Sam won't keep me employed. I thought I'd give you a slightly wider story than just the cost of stopping because you can all read the report. I want to take you through a little bit of a bigger narrative in terms of where we are today, how we got here, and where I think technology can play quite a big role. We know that New Zealand has a big infrastructure deficit. I'm sorry, I invented the number, not the deficit itself. But we also know that there's a big opportunity. I think there's a bunch of dimensions within infrastructure narratives that we've already heard about today. I think there's a huge issue in terms of politics and governance. I think there are some big issues around finance. Clearly, there's some issues with investment and maintenance. But technology is one that's quite often seen as something on the side rather than something that runs through all of this. And I think that's one of the big opportunities for ITS. In technology, it's pretty obvious that demand management is one of those big opportunities that are absolutely there. That's a no-brainer. You know, when I was looking at the numbers for Auckland's usage, time of use, you know, the peaks are extraordinary. To keep building infrastructure for peak use is stupid, right? We know that time of use charging is coming. How do we do it well? How do we do it equitably? How do we do network optimization and see them as substitutes for billions in CapEx? Because politics is still about how do we build the biggest road, spend the biggest amount of money, rather than how do we get the best outcomes. I think one of the things we do have to think about is how do we make sure that there is an understanding that the technology that we're talking about is not just something that we talk about between nerds, but we do talk about it with the wider public in terms of why they can have better services as a result of what we can do. And also that there are some serious trade-offs that are involved, and those trade-offs are things quite often that we don't talk about, But fundamentally, we have to be able to tell the story of value, which I think all the predecessors have talked about, is we have to be able to tell people that as a result of this change, there is something in it for you. If there is not something in it for our community, they don't care. We have to be able to sell this. You have to sell good stories. But before I start into telling the good stories, I want to start with the politics, because I think the politics is fundamental to why and how we make decisions when it comes to infrastructure and technology going forward. So the very quick version of this is the world has gotten better and worse over the course of the last 100 years. We've reduced inequality between countries, but inequality within countries has increased. And as a result, we've seen a massive increase in polarization in societies, and that's why politics sucks so much, right? We're at war with each other. And what that has meant is we've lost social license and people have lost trust in our institutions and in each other. So less than a third of us, only about a third of us trust media, less than half of us trust government. And when you think about what that means for us, what it means is, you know, that stop-start that I think was a Scott that you showed us, you know, that picture of, sorry, I've forgotten your name. Scott, good. See, I'm terrible with faces and names. I can't believe I remembered. But what you showed in terms of all those policies being started and within 2 years being cancelled, it's partly because of this. What we've got is a situation where people don't trust our institutions, our politics has become quite fractured, and what we're likely to see is frequent changes in governments and frequent changes in policies. So you can have the best technical ideas, but if you don't have the social license and the political support behind it, what you get is one lot comes in and does it, the second lot comes in and undoes it. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we face. As a result, what we find is our politicians are unwilling to do the hard work and they want to sell us unicorns, right? And we all know that unicorns are beautiful things, but they're mythical. And what I mean by unicorns is you've got to choose two of those three things between good, fast, and cheap. There are very few things that are good, fast, and cheap, but although I did like your $100,000 camera, that sounded like all of those three things. And maybe there are some unicorns, hey? My name is Suzanne. Suzanne, thank you. So she knew I couldn't remember. But really, we're generally choosing between things that are low quality, things that are slow, and things that are expensive. When we've got unicorns, we've got to sell them hard. And I think that's where a lot of the opportunity in technology lies. But the reason why our politicians promise unicorns, these no-cost solutions, is because there is no center. Societies are fractured. As a result, we're unable to hold any ideas for any extended period of time. And because we can't hold ideas for any extended period of time, it becomes a real battleground in terms of how much money do we spend, whose money do we spend, how do we spend it? And as a result, our policies become really captured by, I think, a lot of that flip-flop that I talked about. We're also likely to see a lot more opportunities for rapid experiments. So New Zealand is the king of pilots. We pilot everything, but we don't necessarily scale them up into big things, right? And I think that's a real risk. What we find is when we've got politics that is really fractured, when governance is trying to get things done fast rather than to get things done right, what you tend to see is policies that are implemented and quite often done in unorthodox ways, and quite often those are the things that are undone over time. One of the challenges with that is when we try to do things quickly, we try and move our institutions out of the way. So the public servants, the quality of policy advice, the regulatory impact statements, they all become difficult and problematic things on the way to getting things done. And because we're not doing that good work in terms of making sure the policy is right, quite often the thing that's missed is the equity part. What we find is the politics then becomes the next prime minister to be goes, well, that was a poorly run process, so that must have been a bad idea. Select me and I will undo that thing that nobody likes. And I think that is probably the biggest challenge to the technology that we're talking about, not the technology itself, but the fact that the politics and the governance that's wrapped around it is not capable of carrying the message. And New Zealand is going to experience exactly that. So if you look at our political kind of share over the course of the last 100-odd years, what you can see is that our political system has become more fractured over time, right? And in more recent years, you can see the minor political parties are taking much bigger share of our seats. And minor political parties, they are designed to divide and conquer. The whole point is to be divisive. Find an issue that pisses people off, and then you can get more votes, right? Tolling. Nobody likes tolling. I'm anti-tolls. Road user charges. Terrible. I'll cancel it if you elect me. It doesn't matter if you can do it or not. It creates that political fracture, that political wedge. What I want to tell you is essentially keep this in the back of your mind. Do not think for a moment that the politics and the social license that goes behind it is not important. In fact, that is probably the biggest risk that we see. When it comes to the state of infrastructure, where we are in New Zealand today is we actually do have fairly good infrastructure, but we have neglected it for a very long time. And a slightly annoying picture on the left-hand side, but essentially if you see where the bits of investment has taken place, in the shaded green area is what we should have invested for maintenance. The green area is what we have actually invested in terms of new stuff, and the orange bar is what we should have been investing for the last 40 years. And so that accumulated shortfall is really where it was. And essentially what happened, particularly through that period of the reforms in New Zealand, some of you would have been around back then, we really made some big decisions around what not to do. We reduced investment in maintenance in particular. We didn't look after the assets that we had. And the infrastructure deficit that we experience today is really because of those terrible decisions that we made through the period of the 80s and early 90s. Pretty much from 2000 onwards, we started to invest a lot more. And you can see that on the right-hand side, when you look at kind of our surface infrastructure in New Zealand relative to the OECD, we were well below where we should have been relative to our peers pre-early 2000. And since then, we've kind of gotten back to the middle. But while we have done that, while we are expending more money, we've forgotten how to spend money well. So you'd have all seen the work from the Infrastructure Commission that shows that we spend lots of money, but what we get for that money is not very good. We're not getting value for money because we don't have the system capacity and capability to do it well. And there's some real consequences, and the consequences of that are we hurt people all the time in our roads. Our roads are surprisingly not improving in terms of how many people we hurt and how many people we kill in our roads. You would think that the improvement in technology, improvement in the investments that we've made in our roads and our infrastructure would have created better outcomes. On the right-hand side is the picture from TomTom for the last week for Auckland, and you can see the congestion that we experience in the morning and afternoon peaks. So, when we talk about road congestion charging, time of use charging, it's a no-brainer, right? In any infrastructure, the fact that we have these bottlenecks in terms of safety outcomes, in terms of these extraordinarily inefficient use of our resources, there are some really, really important lessons that we can think about. We also know that it's not just us, right? We talked about telecoms before. We do the same thing with the utilities. All the talk is about how do we bring the peaks down so that we can make a lot better use of the infrastructure that we do have. The physical constraint in our infrastructure is not that we don't have enough infrastructure. It's that we all want to use it at the same time. I was coming back from Hamilton the other day. I left Hamilton at 8 p.m. I can tell you there was no traffic and there was plenty of infrastructure. There was no capacity constraint. Even in the Bombays, it was fine, right? And typically, you come during the daytime, and it's blockages up all the way. So there are some real opportunities here in terms of not just the investment that we have, but how we kind of manage the assets that we have today. This is a very complicated and noisy picture, but this is a picture out of the infrastructure deficit report that I wrote a few years ago. This is how we kind of made up the number. But essentially on the left-hand side is all the reasons why we have a deficit, but on the right-hand side is roughly how much additional investment is required over the course of the next 30 years if we want to build our way out of the deficit. And the answer is, roughly speaking, in real terms, we would have to spend $1 trillion in New Zealand to be able to fill our infrastructure deficit. That's just a stupid number, right? For a country of our size, with 5 odd million people, we're not going to spend $1 trillion to deal with our infrastructure deficit. So if we're not going to invest our way out of it, the question is, what will we do and how will we do it? And before we do that, I think there is an element of figuring out why this happens. And part of it is we have been completely guessing things wrong, right? So, you look at the projections for population and demand. It's kind of that, that old joke about economists and predicting recessions. We've predicted 6 of the last 2 recessions. It's a little bit like that, right? We never get it right. But I was looking at the population projections for Queenstown Lakes over the course of the last 20 years. And the projections are all like, it's going to increase by that much, it increases by that much. The next time, it's going to increase by just a little bit, increases by 2-3 times that. And so for the course of the last 30 years, we've been saying that there's going to be no growth or very little growth in population, but the reality has been much greater. So because we've got all these forecasting errors, and because we get ourselves tied up in the central estimates, we make these big problems. There's also issues with funding and financing. We heard about our National Land Transport Fund. that's not been keeping up with what we need to do for many decades, right? It's been unsustainable and not fit for purpose for many years, and yet we have not made any push to actually fix it. So it's not surprising that we have these issues in terms of why have a deficit when you've got no money, what will we do? We know there are some issues with delivery in terms of the productivity in the sector is particularly poor, but it's also the fact that when we look at why productivity is low, it's that we lose our sector capacity and capability repeatedly in every cycle. But fundamentally, I think the biggest issue that we find is in the coordination aspect. So much of the infrastructure that we're not able to deliver. We can't plan, we can't deliver, we can't improve because we don't coordinate. It's quite often done as single silo decisions, and then we find this massive issue in terms of where this goes. And of course, there's some massive issues in terms of the cost of growth on infrastructure. Somebody's getting really angry in the back. Had enough. I don't want this infrastructure deficit anymore. I agree. But when you look at the growth, the costs of growth, there are some huge amounts of costs that are associated with growth in population and growth in households. So in a typical kind of household, in a typical kind of area in New Zealand, between central and local government, every new household requires about $180,000 of new capital. Now, it doesn't necessarily come with the taxes and the rates and all those other bits and pieces to actually pay for it. So it's not surprising that we have got these real constraints when it comes to managing those demands from growth. If you look at the right-hand side, the demand to invest in new infrastructure is not just the growth in terms of the number of households, it's also the fact that we have other things that we have to spend money on. A big chunk of it is on renewals in that orange bars, all of the data is from LTPs that came out recently. And then there is a whole bunch of increases in the quality, right? The standard of service. Because it's not enough for us to have roads that are like this. As time goes on, we expect better quality. We want things to be smoother, faster, and all of those kinds of things. So we need to be really mindful that our expectations and standards are changing all the time as well. And there are some real consequences of that, right? I think about it in the water infrastructure, for example. Can you really have Auckland quality water in a place like Clutha District that has 7 small settlements? You simply cannot carry the same kind of infrastructure and the cost that goes with it. There are also costs of inaction. I wrote a report on that recently, but essentially it shows you what happens in the picture on the left-hand side. That's the number of people who are employed in the infrastructure delivery sector in New Zealand, in the construction space, right? And essentially, can you see that little cycle that goes through over time? That's essentially the political cycle. We turn things on, we turn things off. We turn things on, we turn things off. And the idea is that while the government is waiting, or the client is waiting for that thing to be turned back on, you will hang on to your people, you will hang on to your kit, and you will hang on to all those relationships. So when I'm ready, everything will be fine again. And it turns out that that's not the case, because you fired your people, you've sold your kit, and the relationships that you had were between people, and those people are not there anymore. And so it's not surprising that when we do this stop-start, when we do this in a sector that already has issues of productivity, what happens is our inability to make consistent long-term decisions has real consequences. And my kind of central estimate is it probably cost us about $12 billion in the last 25 years. We could have bought a lot of kit with that $12 billion. Also, when I think about where we are, my big frustration is just how sexy building new things is. Right? Nobody wants to give you a ribbon-cutting ceremony for maintaining the assets that you've got. It's really annoying. But the reality is that 6 out of $10 are going to be spent on renewals, right? And so maintenance is actually the big part of infrastructure spending in New Zealand and will continue to be. Most of the infrastructure that we will need are already here. And that shows you a little bit of the picture on the right-hand side. So at the moment, we've got about $400 billion of government infrastructure. We've made investments of about $275 billion, but actually most of the investment we've made is in renewals. So essentially, if you think about the net new investment that we've made in infrastructure is tiny relative to the amount of infrastructure that we've already got. So we really have to hold on to the idea that most of what we need in New Zealand is already here. And that is where our greatest strength and greatest opportunity is. If we keep on chasing the political polls, if we keep on chasing the ribbon-cutting opportunities, we're going to miss the big trick that most of the infrastructure that meets New Zealand's needs are in fact already here. And it takes me to a little bit of government. And it's not just about bashing the government, because it's not that they're all feckless people. It's just that we have different kinds of biases. And they're quite fascinating in terms of where the biases are. The picture on the left-hand side is central government expenditure. And those dotted orange green lines are forecasts in the long-term fiscal models. And essentially what you can see is that the predictions from government of how much money they're going to spend on infrastructure are always over-optimistic, right? Just because it's politically very convenient, right? It's always the idea that just trust us, because if you elect us, we're going to spend a bit more money and this infrastructure will be delivered. But it turns out it's quite difficult to deliver big, large, complex projects. And so government does end up spending more money, but what you can see is that the actual spending lags the predictions that are put forward. And on the right-hand side, you can see local government has the opposite problem, where they essentially go, we're not going to spend any more money. We got nothing. And it turns out they end up spending a lot more money because, you know what? Population turns up. So the infrastructure gets built. So they charge DCs, and the new infrastructure gets vested to the local government. But the challenge for them, of course, is that when you build new infrastructure in local government, that increase in maintenance costs is not really paid by the rate income that you get. So all of a sudden, growth doesn't pay for itself, and it creates really, really big problems in terms of why different groups might be thinking about forecasting differently. But essentially what I want to show you here is that we have no idea what's going to happen in the future. When you see a budget from anybody, don't believe it, because it's probably not going to be true. The Infrastructure Commission does a great job of putting together its infrastructure pipeline. It's really, really helpful. I think it's a project that's giving us a lot more insight in terms of what's coming. But essentially, when I split the infrastructure projects within that, between the news on the left-hand side and the renewals on the right-hand side, you can see that we have a lot less clarity around renewals than we have around new projects. And partly it's because quite often renewals are seen as OPEX rather than CAPEX. So we don't think about it as specific projects. And what happens as a result is we put a lot of focus on the bits on the left-hand side, which is the new stuff. But in both of those, I think you can see a very consistent pattern. And the consistent pattern is it's not funded. We know that the investment is going to be made. We know there are things that we have promised, but we haven't put money aside to do those things. And so fundamentally, if you think about where we find ourselves as a country today, where we have fiscal pressures, we have political uncertainty, what we can assume is those new projects are hugely uncertain. And a lot of that happens because of, I think, where we find ourselves in terms of capability. The OECD did this report a few years ago looking at the systems issues in terms of how we do the delivery of infrastructure. And so when it comes to things like policies and tools, New Zealand is actually not too bad. We have, on paper, all the right things to be able to do the right things. But when it comes to our accountability mechanisms, the formal accountability mechanisms, they're very weak. You can, just like the projects that we saw in the UK and other places, you can announce them and you can undo them very quickly. And as a result, we find this constant cycle and churn. We also have some issues in terms of financial management, like I showed you with my forecasts. We say we're going to spend the money, and then we don't spend the money, but then there is no reckoning in terms of why that hasn't happened. So there are some real issues in terms of our wider systems around our governance system that's leading to this problem. So this leads me to where we are. And when I think about the role of technology within this, we know on the left-hand side, we're going to see this incredible amount of demand from population growth, economic change, technological progress, and climate change. These are kind of the obvious kind of things that are driving up the demand for our infrastructure. But on the right-hand side, quite a lot of the effort so far has been on those two unbolded areas around new infrastructure, right? Because all our politicians want to promise you the new road, the new railway service, the new ferry, whatever it might be, a different ferry maybe. Or else it's around spatial planning, because that's been a really big area of progress, which I've been very pleased by, because if you think about where New Zealand was 10 years ago, spatial planning was still an issue that was for nerds and for something at the edge, and we used to deny that there was a problem with housing in New Zealand. The conversation has shifted now. You know, there is broadly a consensus that we have a housing crisis that needs to be resolved with better spatial planning and better delivery of infrastructure. So those things have shifted, and that's really good. But there are two things we're still not doing enough of, and I think this is where you guys sit in that little intersection, and that can create a huge amount of value. One is around demand management. That is about using the assets that we have much better. I think we can squeeze so much more out of the network that we have. We have a massive, massive infrastructure network in New Zealand, but we're not making the most of it. We're still driving and building to peak rather than to the total quantum of stuff that we want to move. And also around the efficiency improvements, both within the network, but also in terms of the technology and the ideas that we can use to both do project management, quality of our assets, asset conditioning, whether it's all of those other bits and pieces as well, where I see there are some really, really big opportunities. So in my mind, what we've got now is a much better conversation around the demand side of infrastructure. We've got some elements of the supply side that we're thinking about, the response, but I think there is a real opportunity in terms of thinking ahead, in terms of where we think about those efficiency improvements and demand management, because I think those will give us really, really big wins. Now, you know, Sarah was telling me about the unicorns that she's experienced in her work over the years, and I think that's exactly what I wanted to show you in this picture today. So when you look at the kind of the BCRs for new builds, and that orange bar, orange kind of box and whisker on the left-hand side is, I think, the last 20-odd projects that the New Zealand government has announced, right? And it shows you the BCRs optimistically are on a median of about two times, right? Nobody believes that, because the BCRs are always high when you plan for a project, and the BCR is always much lower once you've delivered it. But regardless, on the current business cases, they'll give us 2 times BCRs. If you look at the BCR for maintenance and renewals, it's around 6 times. And if you look at ITS projects, and that's looking at the projects that have been taking place in places like the UK with DOTS ITS, in the UK, in Australia, and a few other places, they run at about 5 times in terms of the cost-benefit ratio, so benefit to cost ratio. So really what we've got here is, I think, a real opportunity to think about when we've got new money to spend or we've got new assets to invest in, we have to ask ourselves, 1, did we think about an alternative to that spending? And I think technology in many cases can be that alternative. Or when we're going to invest new infrastructure in those new builds, have we thought about implementing or integrating that technology in it, so that we're able to get much more out of it rather than simply building what we used to build 20, 30, 40 years ago. We can't just build dumb roads, dumb bridges, and dumb tunnels anymore. We do have to think harder about the future. So I think the big task for us is, how do we think about our role, not as a technology to sell, but 1, as a substitute to building new stuff, and 2, to think about when we build new things as a complement to build things that are just a hell of a lot better, a hell of a lot smarter, and as a result, our CapEx will be less and our efficiency will be much greater. So I've taken you through quite a big arc of a story, but essentially what I wanted to remind you is New Zealand starts from a position where we have a big deficit, which is also, I think, a big opportunity for technology. The bits that are letting us down, I think, are very much around politics and governance. I think that's where decision-making is weak, and I think that's where the lack of coordination happens. I think when it comes to technology, the big stories are very much around demand management, around time of use charging, absolutely. But fundamentally, I think it's about shifting the story from those technologies to saying that as a result of our technology, you don't have to spend X many $1 billion on new roads and new bridges. Because of our technology, we can build a smaller road, a narrower road, a faster road, a safer road. I think our stories have to be about substitutes and complements to the alternative, which is $1 trillion of investment to get New Zealand moving. We cannot afford $1 trillion, so I think we have to be able to find a way for us to not only understand the value we create, but the understanding is not to sell to each other, because you guys are all converted, right? You guys are all tech people, you understand this stuff, and for you, this is your bread and butter. But how do we create an understanding in the wider community and our politicians? Because I don't think they see the big unicorn that you could be. There are absolutely trade-offs that we heard about from other people, but those trade-offs are not just about the trade-offs of privacy and those other bits and pieces. The big trade-off, in my mind, is about the value that you create, because every investment in new technology done right is a new road or a new bridge or a new CapEx we don't have to make, or a new CapEx that we can make that is just so much better, so much more efficient, and just creates a much greater value for money for New Zealanders. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Can I please invite all the speakers from the session up here so that we can have a little bit of a Q&A for everybody. Again, there's a chance to upvote some questions that have come through already or ask some more. There's quite a lot of questions in there already, so perhaps find one that's more similar to yours. I'm going to ask these generally. If somebody doesn't want to pick up their hand to take up the question, I will volunteer you. The first question, is there consideration being given to exempting public transport from RUC, especially given that operational funding comes from central government? Yeah.
More? I'm projecting. And also allowed scheme boards to consider public transport exemptions for a time of use charging scheme. I think it's quite a tricky one. You're asking to make a decision quite early on in the piece that distorts those revenue flows. I think about $2 billion a year is tipped into public transport infrastructure and activities, but we get asked a lot for all sorts of different exemptions to be considered, whether it's motorbikes or government fleets. Like, government has big fleets in the health system and police and stuff like that. Yeah, I think it's a decision to come, but it can have quite a distortionary impact on that revenue flow.
Thank you. The next question is, how are you planning on integrating all these systems, RUC, time of use charging, and other taxes, etc., for the users?
That could be a good one for the private sector.
Peter.
Yeah, in and of itself, it's not a huge technical challenge. Any kind of e-RUC device, if you put it out there, or connected car data, if it's got, just needs enough location to know you're in a tolling zone or in a time of use charging zone at a particular time, and then the back end's perfectly capable of taking that and turning it into some kind of record of liability and payment. So that's all really incredibly mature. So it's also kind of off-the-shelf technology. So when the politics is ready and the social license is built, it's pretty straightforward.
So yes, the technology is mature, and that was a question that I got earlier this week, was about back office and how do we make the back office good, better. And so that's one of the ways, is to make sure it can address all of those things, and back offices do that. There's another tech that I didn't get to talk about yet today, and that's distributed ledger technology, which is a subset of blockchain. It's a type of blockchain technology, and it will enable us to do all those things and integrate everything that Scott just described. And we can do it quickly, and we can also return the revenue to the agency in almost real time. So there's no reconciliation between a RUC and a tolling and all the different types. And the other thing that DLT would allow us to do is to create those exceptions that we were just talking about, that Anna just answered about. So for example, if we use distributed ledger technology to do that, we could have a ledger with all of the ambulance and all the healthcare first responders against the ledger of the people who paid, and then we could, in real time, be able to exempt them, or better yet, maybe exempt people who can't afford, who have lower income or aren't able to, underserved neighborhoods. If we know someone's coming from an underserved neighborhood, they would be on a ledger, and we could compare that ledger to the ledger of the tolling, and that can be real-time transactions that happen very fast.
I think also Scott kind of touched on some bundling that could happen around pricing as well, like we see in the electricity sector, all kinds of creative bundling starting to come through. Did you want to add anything further on at that point? Okay. The next question actually is for you, Scott, so you don't get out of it just by being quiet. Any lessons that can be taken from the Singapore experience of updating their electronic RUC pricing system, electronic road pricing system, particularly around the amount of time that takes?
I have empathy for Singapore because it did do quite a big procurement to replace its system, which is a time-of-use charging system. I think it's not a distance-based road user charge, although it could be. I think the lesson there, and I think New Zealand's applied that lesson, is having a single procurement for everyone to have one piece of technology and one supplier is something from the past. And it means that you have an enormous amount of risk with that one supplier. And that indeed was the risk if we go back 20 odd years ago when Germany was the first to do full-scale e-RUC. It had one supplier and it cost went through the roof and it was outrageous. And yeah, I think the key lesson there is to have an open market approach, have different suppliers to cater to different parts of the market. And I think for Singapore, what they've introduced is a technology to replace what they've got from the 90s, which is far more sophisticated with far more capability, and they're not looking to use that capability yet. And by the time they've actually rolled it out, it's obsolete. I mean, they're already at the point where they don't need to put screens in the cars because smartphones enable it, but they didn't have that when they procured it. So yeah, I've written about it on my blog.
Thank you. I've got a question now for you, Jamil. It's a question which refers to your box of whisker chart. So what do you think the cost-benefit ratio is so much more varied for ITS versus for new builds?
Well, mainly because there are quite a wide range of different technologies being applied. And like anything, we just heard, you can buy a new bit of technology and it can go tits up very easily. So we've all had experiences with technology projects that don't work, don't we? So look, it's very much that, but most of the really high BCR ones were very much the ones that were quite relatively small in scale. They were quite often implemented in small pilots and then scaled up. So I think a lot of it's to do with the governance mechanisms in terms of how we procure and implement projects rather than necessarily the projects themselves. But there's a big distribution. There's always a big distribution. And a lot of them were post rather than pre the projects were done. And post BCRs are always a lot more accurate and much more honest than the ones that are done to justify a business case.
Yeah. Thank you. This question I'm pretty sure is for MCERT. So one of you there. Will the government mandate OEMs to provide vehicle data for the purpose of RUC and time of use charging? Do you want me to? Those slidey desks.
At this stage, the government hasn't made any commitment towards anything like that, and the approach that we're taking is more let users and the private sector come up with the options and go that way if it works for them. And that way we move towards something that could be an outcome, and I think it opens up a whole lot of more opportunities for charging. But part of, and like Anna shared earlier, what we're doing is really user focused, and there's a lot of users out there, a lot of vehicles that can't do it. Obviously, if vehicles are coming into the fleet with it and that works for users, then potentially there's an incentive for OEMs to switch that on to provide the user something that they want, but it's not something that we've looked at mandating at this stage.
Thank you. Peter wants a supplementary answer.
Not that I'm digging a defensive moat, but similar standards for everyone would be, from our point of view, right? We know that even the most technological onboard systems now can be influenced and tampered with. And so I think the complexity of mandating is you're actually also mandating a whole lot of event data that needs to come through so that you can do the validation and all the same kind of fraud detection and anti-tamper work that other people who are shoving devices in have to do already.
Thank you. Suzanne, there's a question for you. How can New Zealand implement a telematics-based road tolling system when the national vehicle fleet is old, with an average age of 15 years? Should we wait another 15 years?
No, I think that, and I think we kind of covered this a little bit too, is that it could be ramped up. It could be a choice. As Matthew was saying, it could be a choice in the beginning. It could be part of a larger scheme. It could be, I suspect that we will have different ways of approaching this, that it won't be one single way of doing it. But probably not wait 15 years, but we should do something to start. And I think it's always good to start trying something than to wait 15 years.
Shamil, there's another question for you. How can we tell the ITS story better whilst also preventing polarization of political viewpoints?
My God, that's your job, not my job. That's when you pay me many, many dollars to give you a strategy, right? No, look, that is the million-dollar question, but I think that's the question you need to ask yourselves. You're already very good at telling the technology story. We have to tell the story in terms of the story to government and the story to the public. I think that those two parts are where I don't think we do a strong enough job. So I think that's the opportunities. Rather than a risk, it's about thinking about how else can we describe and narrate our story. And the way I think about it is, for example, in the CapEx story, you know, when I see that, oh, we need to build this mega project, if you tell me that instead of building this mega project, if you spend $200 million on this, we can actually have the capacity and you don't need to build this project for another 20 years, whatever. I think there are some of the trade-offs are a lot bigger than we give ourselves credit for. The other thing I think is being able to speak to the public. I think quite a lot of industry are very focused on speaking to government. But nobody trusts government. So talking to government is not the right place to start. You know, you gotta also have narratives and ability to kind of explain your story and the value that you create for community outside of that. Because only then will the politicians respond to the stories that you tell. So I think it's the theory of change, and that's being a little bit more sophisticated than before. It's very challenging because it's not one group, right? You're a bunch of different people doing a bunch of different things. But I think as an industry body, there is a real strategy in terms of what is our persona, what is the story that we want to say, and how do we tell a story? And I don't think it's about the technology. I think it's about the outcome and the impact of the technology.
Thank you. And also time to look to people whose areas is that profession to help. It's going to be down this end. Regarding ERUC, I'll let you hold it in the middle, the mic. Regarding ERUC, are we considering collaboration with the global journey planning providers? Google and Apple offer advanced car solutions, CarPlay, Android Auto, along with effective mapping and payment capabilities. Peter?
Yes. It's a no-brainer, right? We started off as a hardware company because you needed hardware to get into business, and then we've layered software over that because you needed the software over that. And ultimately, we're a service entity, and the more that we can not have to build all the other layers required to be able to deliver the service, then the easier it is to run our business in that space. So absolutely, it's one of those things we're exploring. Difficulty is it's New Zealand at the arse end of the world, and we're a small market. So you know, your ability to get some really serious grip on these conversations is challenged, but it's absolutely.
Thank you. If I can just add, New Zealand does offer a whole bunch of opportunities that we are hearing from people about as well. So where things like RUC is being tested and piloted elsewhere, we don't have the state boundaries and borders and challenges that other countries do. So we're quite excited about the people that we're hearing from who are quite keen to spend some time here.
Yeah, and so something very interesting about that question is that while Apple and Google do have important real estate in the car, and I have a slide that I didn't have up here that has all the, you know, how it's broken out by model. One of the interesting shifts that's happening in the market is the OEMs are actually looking at moving away from having, and I'm speaking very broadly, so there are, you know, but there is a concern about having Google and Apple own so much real estate in the car, digital real estate, because Google and Apple are actually taking a lot of the revenue for the subscriptions from the car companies. So several of the car companies are actually shifting away from having that be their standard go-to. And so it's a rift that's starting to happen, so it will impact the outcome to that question.
Yeah, I think the next question is for MCERT. Will there be plans for RUC to apply to e-scooters and e-bikes, considering that some motorised vehicles I see online now operate as fast as standardised motorised vehicles?
I did see that question come up. The Minister last year was asked a question about bicycles and said no, they would not be charged RUC, so I suppose in that vein they wouldn't. to be honest, the way RUC is set is not really about the speed of vehicle travels. It's been very much based on a cost allocation model that the ministry operates, that is based on the wear and tear, the size of a vehicle, the impact that it has on the road. So I don't know that a motorised e-scooter would pull itself into that space.
Thank you. Another question, I think, keep hold of that mic. How would authorities identify unlicensed vehicles and unpaid RUC, and how would that be enforced?
Well, yeah, so we do have systems now. Are they fit for purpose in a future state? No. That is one of the things that we're really going to have to work hard on. It is such a big change, as I said before, from moving from that fuel excise duty to something where there is choice. We have non-compliance now. I imagine it will only be, well, I probably shouldn't say it will be magnified, but it is going to be a big thing for us to tackle, and we don't have the answers right now, but we're certainly hoping that as we see that modernisation phase come in next year, that we start to see some really great solutions. No beautiful answer.
Thank you. I'm just going to pass a comment, which is a comment rather than question, but it got upvoted in about you being Prime Minister. Yeah. And there's one that's very similar to one that's come before. How do you balance designing for future integrations without locking yourselves or New Zealand into a system that's not quite right? How can you stay being agile at a nationwide scale?
I think that's what the government has endeavoured to do with this RUC transition journey. Many of you will remember there was a commitment made when the coalition government was first formed for RUC, the transition to RUC to take place in 2027. And the government ultimately chose to actually take a different approach rather than force a transition to that largely manual system that will throw up a ton of problems for us, like the compliance and enforcement challenges just discussed then. So I think this is a much more agile way of navigating this. We expect to spend a lot of time with the private sector next year once the bill comes into force, and really understanding from people what works, what doesn't, what we still need to address and work through that. So we'll be giving advice to ministers next year about what comes next.
Someone else can grab this question, give you a little break. Does New Zealand want to move towards the ETC type tolling system used in Japan? Suzanne, or no, Scott, great.
I'd say no, and the reason being that New Zealand's system is number plate recognition based and Japan is mostly toll tag based, and New Zealand has thankfully almost entirely been able to bypass the toll tag based system. So I don't think we need to, and I don't think we need to partly because of we've got very good number plates. They're very clear, simple number plates, which has meant that we've been able to avoid some of the concerns that some of the others have done. So.
I'm going to ask a kind of a more wider strategic question here, so anyone can pick this up. How can we integrate pricing and strategy across modes and choices, like vehicles, heavy vehicles, public transport, parking, to enable peak management with the view of optimal usage of our infrastructure?
I'll start, then I'll pass it on. I think time of use charging is such an enormous leap forward in the first instance and does a great deal of that. Once you have that, and that is a mountain to climb, and I mean, we'll hear more about it in the next session, but I would still say you can still count the number of time of use charging systems in the world on your fingers. And they've been in place since the 1990s, or 1975. So let's get that. Let's do that and then see where we are and what else you can do beyond that. And in a city that's so car-oriented as Auckland, to be looking at that is so far removed from everywhere else. I think that's where I think a lot of the focus should be. And after that, we can do other things. We can do more interesting public transport ticketing and the rest of it. But yeah, let's climb that mountain and get over the other side.
So the question was how. But first I want to answer that. I think that's a really cool question because it assumes that that when we charge for something, it's really close to the actual service that we're using, and I love that. I think that it's really smart to be able to, the problem with petrol tax is that folks generally don't understand how it works. Maybe they do in New Zealand because it's such a topic now, but they certainly do not in the US. Nobody understands, and so when, yeah, you should probably, I should probably hand the mic to you to talk about this, but I think that it's really important to connect payment to actual service. And that's what that question just described, and I really like that. And I also think that I don't know, it's not a back office thing. It doesn't have to be a connected thing. But when we start charging for actual use of actual service, I mean, it can be through credit cards, it can be through all that. I just want to make sure that it's equitable and aligns with the policy. But I think that that question is really good.
Can I just add one little example? So at Ports of Auckland, for example, they've changed their access fees between nighttime and daytime. And that's been a really simple shift in terms of, really strong pricing signal. If you come in the middle of the night, it's going to be cheaper. And so we don't have to solve the entire network. I think there are other signals and other choke points we can use to be able to manage some of the transition, particularly for heavy use traffic, which is very, very responsive to price signals.
There's a question here, I think probably back for MCERT. What work has been done to look at how many people would face higher costs from a move to RUC?
No. So I think this came up maybe in Scots. Like, we're really conscious of that admin fee and the costs of actually complying with road user charges. I think about the way I pay my power bill right now. I'm with Power Shop. I like that I can plan for when I'm a bit broke over summer and I might have or winter, and kind of prepay things or smooth things out on a fortnightly basis. We're really consciously trying to figure out how we can drive those costs down for how you administer it and how people can experience payment of it, because our current system of buying it in 1,000-kilometre blocks with that $12.44 admin fee is not going to work for the broader population. We're really conscious of that.
I think just one thing to add as well, like it's not necessarily going to cost everybody more. Some people will pay less, some people will pay more. Generally, the transition isn't about making more revenue, it's about collecting it more fairly, so that people are paying based on how much they're using the roads rather than how much fuel they're using. We do need more revenue, but to do that, we need to increase revenue, we need to make sure that we're collecting it fairly first. Yeah, I realise.
Jamil, a question back here for you. And it kind of follows on from you talking about Power Shop as well and the electricity sector parallels again. Are there lessons for ITS that can be learnt from rewiring Aotearoa's approach to renewable energy, winning over politicians by talking about public support, going through public support?
Totally. I think, the rewiring example is very much a big campaign and a public campaign to change hearts and minds of the public first, and then pressure the politicians to be involved. That's always been my strategy. If you want to change people's mind, get the public to talk about it, change the zeitgeist of the country, and then the politicians have to fall back in line, right? So the reality is that politics in New Zealand is done by polling. So the trick is to push the polling, not the politicians, right? So it's about understanding a point of pressure. But yeah, look, I chat to the guys at Rewiring all the time, and man, they're good at marketing, just amazing. And I think that's part of the campaign that we want to run as well, that, you know what, don't build that big bridge, we will help you manage it better. Don't build that big road, because that's a waste of money. We can do it better because we already have the capacity. Whatever it might be, I think so much of the storytelling is making the most of what we have, rather than asking that we must always throw more money, more debt, more cost to New Zealanders, which is not a message that lands well on anybody.
Yeah. Whilst you've got the mic, there's another question here for you, or I think that's probably best directed to you. What are the main causes of rampant inflation in the infrastructure construction sector? It has been far beyond CPI and average wage inflation in the past 20 years.
Yeah, so there's been a few different things that have been driving it. One of it has been just quality increases, so the types of projects we do, the kinds of quality of things that you have to do, a lot of that has increased quite a lot. So when you look at it on unit pricing, that's been one of the causes. But the fundamental driver really has been a lack of productivity. So, a lot of it is to do with stop-start, a lot of it was to do with the way they procure, the changes in structures, all of those kinds of things. For my money, I think one of the biggest challenges for the sector has been that we have this rampant increase, particularly in wage inflation, because we spend so much time firing people, then hiring them again, then training them up, and then firing them again. And so it has this cumulative toll. The other thing that I see a lot here is we have a very long range of small businesses that work with some large organizations. So there are huge administration and coordination costs that lead to, I think, quite a lot of leakage and a lot of cost that has accumulated over time. So it's a whole bunch of different issues. Some of it is materials, but it's a relatively small part if you look at the ultimate composition of inflation in the sector. I think it's largely to do with a lack of productivity and largely to do with stop-start, management practices, and sector fragmentation.
Thank you. Another question for MCERT, I think. General question on, hang on, I keep jumping around while I'm watching them. How do you ensure that car companies collecting data for agencies are regulated, keep that data secure and not use it for other purposes?
I might share this one with Matthew.
We have the Privacy Act that sets out some principles that everyone operating in New Zealand needs to comply with. And so there are rules around how they can collect data, how they use it, and how that works with the user. And so I guess that's the main tool at the moment, and it's not something that we've sort of looked to regulate further at this stage.
Peter, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, unlike a device installed aftermarket by a New Zealand owned and operated company, these manufacturers are already collecting that data, right? So when we're talking about using OEM data, what we're talking is tapping into a data flow that already exists, that's already being offshored for other purposes. And then we're thinking, well, how can we divert some of that back to us? So at a certain fundamental level, we have the high-level frameworks, and that's it. And it'll be exceptionally difficult, I think, to get the OEMs over the line for tighter restrictions, which, may be a good thing from a public good point of view, may make it harder to access OEM data for any of the other purposes that we've been talking about here. So we're not dealing with a blank slate, unless you mandate aftermarket devices by a New Zealand owned and operated company with a stunning track record for privacy and security.
In your dreams, Peter.
I might just add one small point. There are various jurisdictions, Australia is one of them, facing that. They are prohibiting motor vehicles from a certain country from being used for defence purposes because they cannot mandate that that data that is collected by those vehicles and the OEMs won't go back to a unfriendly power. And that shows that they're not able to regulate that.
I've got another question for MCERT. In terms of distribution of funding, are there any plans to use collected data to proportion funding to road controlling authorities based on the amount of use? I think someone in Auckland wrote that.
I think that is part of a fairer system, but that will get caught up in the review I referred to earlier that's come out of the Infrastructure Commission's National Infrastructure Plan, which is worth a read, and it does have a bunch of actions and recommendations in there that the government has accepted, and one of them is a review of the land transport revenue and funding system, so that will very much become a part of that piece of work.
Can I just add a line to that? And it's really around that element of horizontal and vertical equity. So it can't just be those who use the most pay for it. It also has to be a little bit of redistribution within the system. So Auckland is very rich. We produce a huge amount of economic activity and revenue, and we do subsidize the rest of the country when it comes to tax revenue and spending. And that will continue. So we should not assume that user pays means that you get all of it back. There is an element of collectivizing that goes in the background as well. So don't lose sight of that. I think, the picture that you had in terms of, I think, Scott, it was on your chart, not all of it is being charged for the thing. There are some base costs that are shared across the system.
I'm going to wind it up there. I think we've covered most of the topics that came through, and thank you for so many rich questions that have come through on Slido, and I apologise if we didn't get to your specific question. I think everyone's now deserved a break. We want some lunch, and thank you very much to all of our panellists for their openness in answering everyone's questions.